Zhiro moved through the Rust Quarter like a ghost, which was fitting, given his street name, though now the title carried implications he hadn't understood before. Ghost Boy. Not because he was pale or thin or quiet, though he was all those things, but because some part of the street's collective unconscious had recognized what he was before he'd known himself. Something not quite alive in the way normal people were alive. Something manufactured, artificial, a copy of something that had existed 3,000 years ago. The rain had lessened to a cold drizzle that fell mostly downward, with only occasional rebellious drops that shot sideways or hung suspended in defiance of gravity. The storm was passing, moving northeast toward the better districts where reality held stable and the wealthy cultivators lived in towers of jade and spirit stone, never having to worry about whether their homes would still exist in the same dimension when they woke in the morning. Zhiro's destination was a place he had discovered 2 years ago, during one of his scavenging runs through the deepest parts of the quarter. A basement beneath a basement, accessed through a collapsed section of wall that opened onto stairs leading down into darkness. The building above had been condemned 70 years ago after a reality distortion had inverted its 4th floor, placing it somehow both above and below the 3rd floor simultaneously in a configuration that had driven 3 scholars mad trying to map it. The city guard had evacuated the residence, sealed the entrance with cultivation arrays, and left it to slowly decay into the chaos of the Rust Quarter. But the arrays had weakened over decades. Zhiro had found a way through them, not by breaking the formations, which would have required cultivation he didn't possess, but by discovering that the arrays didn't extend fully into the subterranean levels. Whoever had set them had been focused on keeping people from entering the building from street level, had never imagined someone might tunnel through adjacent cellars and come up from below. The lower basement was relatively stable, as such things were measured in the Rust Quarter. Reality held mostly consistent there, probably because the foundations had been laid before the 5th Sunder, when the stone itself had been blessed by cultivators who understood how to anchor it against metaphysical shifts. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet by 15, with walls of ancient brick that sweated moisture in the humid summer months and frost in the winter. No furniture except what Zhiro had scavenged, a broken crate that served as a table, a pile of rags that passed for bedding, a cracked clay jar that held the few copper crescents he managed to save. It wasn't home. Home implied warmth, safety, belonging. But it was shelter, which was more than many in the Rust Quarter could claim. Zhiro descended the narrow stairs carefully, one hand trailing along the wall for balance, his other hand held before him because the darkness down here was absolute. The kind of darkness that existed before humans had invented fire, before they had even understood that darkness was simply the absence of light rather than a thing unto itself. His eyes, which saw reasonably well in dim conditions, another gift from whatever genetic engineering had gone into his creation, could make out only vague shapes. He reached the bottom and felt along the wall until his fingers found the candle stub he kept on a small ledge. Beside it, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry, were the flint and steel he'd traded 3 Sunder-touched artifacts for 2 years ago. Precious beyond measure in a place where fire could mean the difference between freezing to death and surviving another night. It took 6 strikes before sparks caught in the candle's wick. The flame guttered, nearly died, then steadied into a small sphere of warm light that pushed back the darkness by perhaps 3 feet in every direction. Not much, but enough. In that meager light, Zhiro could see his home for what it truly was. A hole in the ground where a 17-year-old boy, who wasn't quite human, hid from a world that would kill him if it knew what he was. He sank down onto his pile of rags, every muscle in his body screaming protest. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation with Kong and the subsequent flight through the quarter's twisted streets had burned away, leaving only exhaustion, so profound it felt like sickness. His hands shook. His vision kept trying to tunnel at the edges. His throat throbbed where Kong's fingers had crushed his windpipe, and he suspected the bruising extended deep into the tissue, the kind of internal damage that would make swallowing painful for weeks. But he was alive. Impossibly, against all odds, despite facing 3 cultivators. One of them foundation building stage, he was alive. Because he had killed them first. The thought made his stomach clench, threatening to bring up bile again, though there was nothing left in him to vomit. He had killed people before. This was the Rust Quarter, where survival sometimes meant violence, where a scavenger who wouldn't defend his finds was a scavenger who starved. But those had been desperate struggles, knife fights in dark alleys, moments of panic where it was kill or be killed, and the killing had been accomplished with crude weapons and cruder technique. This had been different. He hadn't even touched Kong beyond grabbing his wrist. Hadn't struck the scarred enforcer with anything resembling a weapon. Hadn't intended to make the young one's chest explode in that horrible display of impossible geometry. He had simply existed near them, and his existence had been lethal. The interface at the edge of his vision pulsed softly, drawing his attention. Thread Warden status. Zhiro stared at it for a long moment, then did something he hadn't dared try during his flight through the streets. He focused on it directly, willing it to expand, to explain, to make sense of what had happened to him. The interface responded immediately, text scrolling across his vision in that same gold-on-darkness script that bypassed his eyes to write directly on his consciousness. Thread Warden, detailed status. Host information asterisk. Name, Zhiro. Designation, Clone 7A, 7th Seal, 1st iteration. Biological age, 17 years. Activation age, 16 years, 47 days. Genetic template, First Warden, 99. 97% match, asterisk asterisk. Template age at sampling, 3,847 years post-mortem. 3,847 years. The first Thread Warden had been dead for nearly 4 millennia, and yet here Zhiro sat, wearing his face, carrying his bloodline, manufactured from genetic material that should have degraded to nothing centuries ago. Physical condition asterisk. Cultivation, none, impossible, no meridians. Body tempering, layer 0/10, untrained. Overall health, poor. Chronic malnutrition, estimated 2+ years. Dehydration, moderate. Throat trauma, recent, healing slowly. Minor lacerations, hands, knees. Spiritual exhaustion, severe. Spiritual exhaustion. He had no cultivation, no spiritual energy to exhaust, and yet somehow he had managed to drain something. Perhaps whatever force the Thread Arts drew upon wasn't infinite, even in him. Thread Arts status asterisk. Awakening, complete, triggered by void-touched artifact. Control, none 0. 1% mastery, asterisk asterisk. Instinctive use, 3 instances recorded. Instance 1, cultivation unraveling, Kong, foundation building stage. Instance 2, meridian implosion, unnamed, chi condensation stage. Instance 3, energy reversal plus reality breach, unnamed, chi condensation stage. Warning, untrained Thread Arts extremely dangerous. Warning, each use risks permanent reality damage. Warning, host currently incapable of controlled application. Zhiro read the warnings 3 times, his chest tightening with each pass. Extremely dangerous. Not to his enemies, though that much was obvious, but to reality itself. He was a weapon that didn't know its own trigger, that could fire accidentally and destroy things he never meant to harm. Corruption status asterisk. Hollow essence 0. 0% asterisk asterisk. Sanity 100%. Stability unstable but improving. Note: hollow corruption inevitable with Thread Arts use. Note: corruption above 50% results in personality changes. Note: corruption above 100% results in hollow ascendant transformation. Note: you were designed to reach 100% corruption while maintaining sanity. Note: this has never been successfully achieved. The words seem to mock him. Designed to reach 100% corruption. Built to be consumed by something called hollow essence while somehow retaining his mind, his self, his humanity, if he could even claim humanity when he was manufactured rather than born. And it had never been successfully achieved. How many had tried? How many versions of himself, clone 1A through clone 6 whatever, had been created and failed and been terminated before they could become whatever threat a corrupted Thread Warden represented? Active abilities *. Thread Sense dormant. Requires training to activate. Thread Strike, instinctive only, no conscious control. Thread Severance, instinctive only, extremely dangerous. Additional abilities locked, insufficient mastery. Quests *. Main Survive. Recommended, find shelter, acquire food/water. Recommended, avoid Bronze Fong retaliation. Recommended, learn to control thread arts. Difficulty extreme. Hidden, discover your origin. Objective, learn why you were created. Objective, find other clones, if any exist. Objective, understand the Seventh Seal's purpose. Reward unknown. Difficulty impossible. Hidden, prevent the Seventh Seal from turning. Objective, do not become the key that opens the door. Failure condition, reality ends. Reward, continued existence. Difficulty. Zhiro closed his eyes, willing the interface to minimize. It obliged, shrinking back to a subtle presence at the edge of his perception. Though he could feel it there, waiting, ready to provide information he didn't want about a destiny he'd never chosen. The candle flame guttered in a draft that came from nowhere, and in its dancing light, Zhiro examined his hands. They looked the same as they always had, thin, long-fingered. The hands of someone who had never done hard labor, but had spent years carefully handling delicate objects. But now, when he focused, when he looked with something that wasn't quite sight, he could see the faint golden lines traced across his skin. The sigils. The Thread Warden markings that had burned themselves into his flesh during the awakening. They formed patterns too complex to follow, geometric designs that hurt to examine for too long, that suggested meanings in languages he'd never learned. He turned his hands over, studying his palms. More sigils there, concentrated at the points where his lifeline and heartline intersected, where fortune-tellers claimed to read destinies in the whirls of skin. Whatever destiny these marks proclaimed, it wasn't one any fortune-teller could have predicted. A sound from above froze him in place. Footsteps on the floor of the collapsed building, careful and measured. Multiple sets, at least 3 people, moving with the practiced quiet of those who hunted in the dark places of the world. Sure he came this way? A voice, male, rough with the accent of the southern docks. Lin saw him enter through the collapsed wall. Said he looked half dead. A second voice, younger, eager. Foundation building cultivators reward for the one who brings him in. Alive preferably, but his head will do if we can't manage the first. Bronze Fong. They had tracked him somehow, despite the rain and the reality distortions and his careful attempts to obscure his trail. Either they had a tracker with abilities Zhiro didn't understand, or someone had sold his location for the reward. Probably the latter. In the Rust Quarter, loyalty extended exactly as far as the coin in your pocket, and no further. Zhiro moved with agonizing slowness, reaching for the candle. His shadow stretched across the wall, grotesquely elongated by the flame's low angle, and in that shadow he saw something that made his breath catch. For just a moment, perhaps a half-second, perhaps less, his shadow wasn't his own. It was taller, broader through the shoulders, wearing robes that billowed in a wind that didn't exist. The shadow of the figure he had seen during his awakening, the thing made of light and impossible geometry that had spoken in that voice like grinding reality. Then it was just his shadow again, small and thin and very mortal. "Check the stairs," the first voice commanded. "You and Hong go down. Wei, and I will secure the perimeter in case he rabbits." Footsteps approached the stairwell. Zhiro had perhaps 5 seconds before they descended into visibility, before the light from above. They would have better light sources than his pitiful candle, probably spirit stone lamps that never flickered, would reveal his hiding place. He could run. There was another way out of this basement, a narrow crawlspace that led into the city's ancient sewer system. He had discovered it months ago, had kept it secret as the ultimate escape route for exactly this kind of situation. The sewers were a nightmare of reality distortions and toxic gases and things that shouldn't exist, but they were also a maze that even the gangs hesitated to enter. But running meant abandoning everything he owned. The few copper crescents that represented weeks of scavenging. The flint and steel that had cost him 3 valuable artifacts. The moth-eaten blanket that kept him from freezing on winter nights. Everything that made survival in the Rust Quarter possible, however marginally. And running meant they would chase him into the sewers, where the reality distortions were worse, where his untrained thread arts might activate accidentally and cause who knew what kind of destruction. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Zhiro made his decision. He couldn't fight. The encounter with Kong and his men had left him spiritually exhausted, and he had no idea how to deliberately activate the thread arts that had manifested so catastrophically in the square. Running would just delay the inevitable, which left one option. He pinched out the candle between his fingers, ignoring the brief burn, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. Then he pressed himself against the wall beside the stairs, into the deepest shadows, and did what he had done his entire life. Became as still and quiet as death itself, barely breathing, his heartbeat slowing through sheer force of will until even he could barely feel it. Ghost boy. Not human. Not alive in the normal sense. Maybe that was an advantage. Light spilled down the stairs as the 2 enforcers descended. Not spirit stone lamps. Those would have been too valuable to risk in a place like this, but oil lanterns with polished reflectors that threw harsh illumination across the basement's brick walls. The light revealed nothing but emptiness. No candle, no boy, just water-stained bricks and the kind of desolation that came from decades of abandonment. Nothing here, the younger enforcer said, sounding disappointed. He was perhaps 25, with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd advanced to chi condensation recently, and thought that made him invincible. Lin must have been seeing things. This place is empty. The older one, Han, based on the earlier conversation, said nothing. He was perhaps 40, with the scarred knuckles and watchful eyes of someone who had survived 30 years in the gangs by being careful rather than brave. His gaze swept the basement in a methodical pattern, checking corners, examining the floor for footprints in the dust, looking for any sign of recent occupation. His eyes passed over Zhiro 3 times. Each time, Zhiro felt certain he'd been spotted. His stillness couldn't be perfect. No mortal could hold that perfectly still, not breathing, not blinking, not even shaking with the cold. But each time, Han's gaze moved on, as if Zhiro were simply part of the wall, another brick in the foundation, beneath notice. The ghost boy effect. That thing that made children avoid him, that made beggars refuse to share their fires, that made even old moth flinch from his touch. Whatever it was, whatever wrongness people sensed in him, it was working now in his favor, making him ignorable, beneath attention, easy to dismiss as nothing. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe the thread arts were helping, bending reality around him in subtle ways that made him harder to perceive. The interface had mentioned thread sense as a dormant ability. Perhaps it worked passively, even without training, making him sensitive to when others were looking and allowing him to avoid their attention. Satisfied? The younger enforcer asked, impatience creeping into his voice. Can we get back to the warm levels? This place gives me the crawls. Han's eyes swept the basement one final time, lingering for a heartbeat on the shadows where Zhiro pressed himself against cold brick. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah. Nothing here. Let's check the next. A sound from above cut him off. A crash, followed by shouting. Both enforcers' heads snapped toward the stairs, training overriding caution. That came from. Move. They bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, their lantern light receding rapidly until Zhiro was left alone in darkness, so complete it felt solid, like he could reach out and touch the absence of light. He remained frozen for a count of 100, just in case it was a trick, just in case they were waiting above for him to reveal himself. When no one returned, when the sounds from above faded into the general chaos that always filled the Rust Quarter after dark, he finally allowed himself to move. His legs nearly gave out. He'd been holding that position for perhaps 5 minutes, but it had felt like hours, every muscle locked, every nerve screaming for release. He stumbled to his makeshift bed and collapsed onto it, his body shaking with reaction. That had been too close. Far too close. If Hon had been slightly more observant, slightly more paranoid, slightly less willing to believe his eyes. The interface pulsed. Skill discovered. Presence suppression. When motionless, you are extremely difficult to detect. This skill improves with practice. Current level, basic. Quest update, survive. You have evaded Bronze Fong hunters, temporarily. Warning, they will return with more resources. Recommended. Find new shelter within 24 hours. 24 hours. A full day to find someplace else to hide. Someplace the Bronze Fong hadn't already marked as a potential refuge. In a quarter where every basement and crawl space and abandoned building was known to someone, where the gangs had informants in every shadow, where nowhere was truly safe. Zhiro lay on his pile of rags, staring up at darkness, so complete he couldn't see his own hand inches from his face, and laughed. It came out as a broken, slightly hysterical sound that echoed off brick walls and made him sound unhinged even to himself. He was 17 years old, no 16, because apparently he'd lost a year somewhere, had been activated rather than born, and he had just learned he was a manufactured copy of a dead man, designed for a purpose he didn't understand, marked for a destiny he'd never chosen, and hunted by a criminal gang that wanted him dead, or alive with emphasis on the dead. And his primary skill, according to the interface that had invaded his consciousness, was being forgettable. The laughter died as quickly as it had come, leaving only exhaustion. Zhiro closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the darkness, and tried to think. He needed food. Hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the spiritual exhaustion from using the thread arts had burned through what little reserves he had. His stomach cramped with hunger so acute it bordered on nausea, and his mouth was dry despite the water he'd swallowed from puddles during his flight. He needed water. Clean water, not the brackish mixture of rain and runoff that pooled in the Rust Quarter's twisted streets, the kind of water that gave you fever dreams and the kind of sickness that killed you slowly. He needed a new hiding place. Somewhere the Bronze Fong hadn't marked. Somewhere the reality distortions were mild enough that he wouldn't wake up in a different dimension. Somewhere he could rest without fear of discovery. And he needed answers. About what he was, why he'd been created, what the seventh seal meant, what would happen when if it turned. The interface had said failure meant reality ends. Not his life. Not the city or the empire, or even the world. Reality itself. Everything. Existence. That seemed like the kind of stake that should come with an instruction manual. But there was no manual. Just a scared teenager who wasn't quite human, hiding in a basement, hunted by gangs and watched by forces he couldn't begin to comprehend. Zhiro's hand crept to his throat, fingers gently probing the bruises Kong's grip had left. The flesh was swollen, tender, probably showing fingerprint-shaped marks in purple and black. It hurt to swallow, hurt to breathe deeply, would hurt for days or weeks. But he was alive. And somewhere in this city, in a building called the Azure Dragon Academy, if the stories were true, there were people who understood thread arts. People who might have answers about what he was meant to do, how to control the power that had manifested so catastrophically. People who might also want to dissect him, study him, use him for purposes just as dark as whatever the Bronze Fong intended. But what choice did he have? Staying in the Rust Quarter meant death, sooner rather than later. The Bronze Fong would never stop hunting him, not when he'd unmade one of their captains and killed 2 of their enforcers. They couldn't afford to let such an insult stand, couldn't allow word to spread that a mortal street rat had destroyed cultivators. Running meant dying slowly in the wilderness, without resources or knowledge of how to survive beyond the city's walls, where spirit beasts and reality distortions and simple starvation would claim him within days. Which left finding someone, anyone, who understood thread arts, who could teach him control before he accidentally unraveled something critical, like the fabric of space-time itself, and fulfilled whatever dark prophecy the interface kept hinting at. The Azure Dragon Academy. It was a place he'd heard about in whispers and rumors, a place where the wealthy sent their children to learn cultivation and martial arts, where prodigies who caught the eye of powerful cultivators were taken to become disciples. A place of jade towers and spirit stone formations, where reality held stable and predictable, where the rules of the 5 great empires applied instead of the Rust Quarter's chaotic survival of the fittest. A place he had absolutely no way of entering legitimately. But then, he'd never done anything legitimately in his life. He was a scavenger, a thief when necessity demanded it, someone who survived by finding ways around rules and barriers and the expectations of others. Surely getting into the academy couldn't be harder than surviving 16 years, in the Rust Quarter. The thought was almost funny. Almost. Zhiro reached out in the darkness until his fingers found the clay jar where he kept his savings. 13 copper crescents, representing months of careful scavenging and sales to the black market dealers. Not much, but enough to buy passage on a merchant's cart leaving the Rust Quarter, enough to bribe a guard who wasn't too attentive, enough to purchase a set of clothes that didn't scream street rat to anyone with eyes. Maybe enough to survive a little longer. He wrapped the crescents in a scrap of cloth, tied the bundle securely, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his ragged shirt, close against his chest where pickpockets would have to literally cut him open to steal it. Then he lay back down, pulling his thin blanket over himself despite the summer heat, and closed his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too active, replaying the confrontation with Kong over and over, analyzing what had happened, trying to understand what he'd done and how he might do it again deliberately. The scarred enforcer's chest exploding. The young one's body seizing. Kong's cultivation unraveling like thread pulled from cloth. Thread. Everything kept coming back to thread. Thread arts. Thread warden. Thread sense. As if reality itself was woven like fabric, and he had been given the ability to find loose ends and pull. What happened when you pulled too hard? When you unraveled something load-bearing? The interface had warned about reality damage. Permanent reality damage. The kind of thing that turned neighborhoods into places like the Rust Quarter, where rain fell wrong and buildings existed in impossible configurations and people disappeared into spaces between spaces. And he was supposed to learn to control this? To master something so fundamental and dangerous that using it wrong could break the world. The thought should have been terrifying. Was terrifying. But beneath the terror, smaller and quieter but undeniable, was something else. Excitement. For the first time in 16 years, Zhiro had power. Not the kind that came from cultivation, from decades of meditation and pill consumption and lucky encounters with spiritual herbs. Not the kind that was hoarded by the wealthy and denied to the poor, that created hierarchies of strength where mortals like him existed at the very bottom. This was different. This was his. Built into his bones and blood, and the impossible genetic engineering that had created him. And once he learned to control it, once he understood how it worked, the Bronze Fong wouldn't be a threat. The gangs and their cultivators and their territorial disputes would become irrelevant. He could defend himself, could stand against foundation-building stages, and maybe even higher realms, could become exactly what his creators had intended. A weapon. A tool. Something manufactured for someone else's purpose. The excitement died. Zhiro opened his eyes, though in the absolute darkness it made no difference, and stared at where he knew the ceiling was. He was 17 years old. No, 16, and he kept forgetting that, kept having to correct himself. and he had just learned that his entire existence was a lie. That he wasn't a person but a thing, created in some laboratory by people who wanted to use him, designed to eventually sacrifice himself for purposes he didn't understand. Clone 7A. The designation suggested 6 previous attempts, 6 other versions of himself who had failed whatever tests they'd been put through and been terminated like defective machinery. What made him different? What made him worth keeping alive when the others had been destroyed? The interface had said he was defective, had developed consciousness when he wasn't supposed to, had gained free will that his designers had tried to prevent. Maybe that was his advantage. Maybe being broken meant being unpredictable, impossible to fully control, capable of choices that no programmed lock would ever make. Or maybe it just meant he would fail in a more interesting way than his predecessors. Outside, in the broken streets of the Rust Quarter, something howled. Not a dog or a wolf. Those were too mundane for this place. Something that existed in the spaces where reality was thin. Something that had been sleeping until the disturbances caused by Zhiro's awakening had roused it. The sound was lonely and hungry, and filled with a kind of need that had nothing to do with physical appetite. It was the sound of something that wanted to exist, that resented being trapped between dimensions, that would tear apart anything it could reach just for the joy of touching something real. Zhiro listened to it echo through the quarter's twisted alleys until it faded into distance, and wondered if that was what he would become. Something caught between states, neither fully human nor fully whatever Thread Wardens were supposed to be, trapped in existence without purpose or destiny or hope. The candle stub sat on its ledge, cold and dark. He could relight it, could push back the darkness for a few more hours, could pretend that the small circle of light made him safe. But light attracted attention. And attention, right now, meant death. So he lay in the darkness and waited for morning, and tried not to think about the fact that he wasn't sure whether sunrise would find him in the same basement he'd fallen asleep in, or whether the reality distortions would shift and drop him somewhere else, somewhere worse. The Rust Quarter was full of stories about people who'd gone to sleep in safe places and woken in hell. Zhiro suspected he'd already been living in hell. He just hadn't known it was manufactured. With that, we come to the end of Chapter 3 of Episode 1. If you liked this, please do give a like to the video. A like and a comment from you is encouraging to the author. If you wish to follow this story for the upcoming chapters, do subscribe to the channel. This story is being written exclusively for our channel. Any comments and appreciation for the story will be passed on to the author.